This year, 23 women will be on the ballot for governor of their state. That's up 44% from 2018. And now, of course, the country has its first woman vice president in Kamala Harris. But while there's been a great deal of progress for women in politics over the past decade, so far it hasn't extended to the Oval Office. A new book is exploring the reasons behind that. It's called Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet. Joining me now to talk about the challenges faced by women in politics is the author of that book, NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale, and Amanda Hunter, the executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation. That's an organization dedicated to advancing women's equality in politics. Thank you both so much for being here. Ali, I want to start with you. Now, of course, I want people to read the book, which I got a copy of last night. But can you kind of give us a quick kind of Spark Notes version about what was the verdict? What did you find? Why haven't women been able to win the highest office in the land? And, since we're likely to see a number of Republican women run for president in 2024, I'm curious if you found in your reporting any sort of differences between how Democrats and Republicans ran for office in terms of women.
Yeah, big differences between the parties, Caitlin, and I'm so happy to be here with you sharing this because some of the reporting that I do in this book, you were there for with me on the road with people like Kamala Harris and Senator Elizabeth Warren as they were vying for the presidency. And it's why 2020 provided this really perfect moment to test this theory of why America hasn't elected a female president yet, in large part because in 2016, the country showed a real willingness to elect a female president because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I know that's not the metric by which we elect presidents in this country, but certainly it showed a widespread willingness and a desire to elevate women and elect them to this highest office. Of course, we fell short of that in 2016, and it looked as if 2020 were a moment where a woman could rise to the top of the Democratic Party apparatus. In the end, though, the candidate who voters thought was safest or least risky ended up being now President Joe Biden.
That's such an interesting dynamic, and there's a part of the book which you kind of reminded me of, which I had forgotten about, was a debate moment in which Elizabeth Warren kind of pointed to all the men on the stage and numbered the amount of times that they lost and said that she and Amy Klobuchar were the only ones on stage that had actually won elections through and through. So it's an interesting dynamic, and we'll see kind of how that pans out in the next election. Kind of, Amanda, going towards this next election that we have right in front of us in 2024, we do have a record number of women who have made it through their primaries and will be on the ballot for governor. And I think this is a really interesting dynamic because in some of those races, you'll have a woman versus another woman. And I'm curious kind of whether and how that changes voter opinion when you have a woman running against another woman.
Well, thank you so much. It's so great to be here. And our foundation has done nonpartisan research on women running for governor in particular for more than 20 years. And we have found broadly that women have to do much more to prove to voters that they're qualified, particularly for executive office. Voters are much more comfortable supporting women to be part of a deliberative body like Congress. But if she's going to be CEO, they need a lot more evidence that she's up to the job. We had previously only looked at the dynamics of women running against men because that has been the norm for so long. And we had always thought that if a woman ran against another woman, that would cancel out a lot of gender bias. Unfortunately, that's not the case. What we found is that in many cases, it amplifies gender bias. When two women run against each other, voters demanded to know why either woman was qualified. Voters scrutinized both women's appearances, and the first woman to make a negative comment during a debate, which is a very normal part of campaigning, contrasting with an opponent, paid a price with voters. So it shows that women are still held to a higher standard even when running against another woman for governor.
I mean, that's such a fascinating dynamic, especially since we're kind of, applauding the idea that you have so many women running for office that they're running against each other, but some of these kind of deep-seated challenges still exist. And Ali, that makes me kind of curious about women voters. We're talking about women candidates, but I'm curious about women voters because, of course, they're not a monolithic group, but I think in this election, they are a key constituency to watch because they're not a monolithic group. And you're having these issues of education and abortion really shape this election, which I think affects women in particular. And, my experience on the campaign trail was I would talk to a lot of women voters who would often, make assessments about how other voters would act. In other words, saying, I would support this woman candidate, but I'm just not sure how others would. And so that kind of leads to the electability question. So I'm curious kind of what you learned about women voters in your reporting.
Well, again, not a monolith, and in no way should that be surprising. But I do think that there were things over the course of 2016 and then again in 2020 that people seemed sort of surprised at. For instance, the idea that Trump was able to win among white women, despite the fact that historically the trend is that white women tend to be more conservative than the larger group of women on the whole, which does ultimately trend more Democratic. But I think that when you look at 2022 and moving forward, women in the suburbs specifically are a really fascinating group that we've seen be energized both by the reproductive access issue, but as well by the issue of education. We don't yet have enough data points electorally to point to, but I think that's going to be one of the interesting things as we look to the midterms. But just broadly speaking about the idea of electability, I think it's completely fair for voters to ask if the candidate who they want to support can be a winner. But ultimately, when you decide to vote for them, it's who are you giving the benefit of the doubt to? And what's clear is that more often than not, people are willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the men more than they are to the women. You saw it in that moment that you talked about on the debate stage and that I talk about in the book, the idea that even though Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren had won more campaigns than their male counterparts had lost on that stage, they still were not seen as electable as their male counterparts. And that's one of the realities that we talk about in the book, which is just if you elect women, they become electable.
Yeah, as simple as that, right? Amanda, what's interesting, too, is that, while we haven't had a woman in the highest office here, we do have women who are leading other countries. One of them, of course, is Sanna Marin in Finland. She's the prime minister there. And she has taken a huge beating in the headlines at home because these videos surfaced of her attending rock festivals and dancing, and she's had to apologize profusely. But the fallout may cost her re-election next year. And this kind of raises the question of even when women are elected into the highest office, they still perhaps face somewhat of a double standard. I'm curious your take on that.
Well, you're absolutely right. And we talk a lot at the foundation about what we call an imagination barrier. It's difficult for voters to picture women in the highest levels of government simply because they have not seen it before. And some of the criticism that we've seen about Madam Prime Minister with her clothing and the way that she dresses also is emblematic of the fact that she is breaking barriers. She is young. She is a young mother. And that is why I think we see a lot of pearl clutching around her going out. We've seen in our own research and focus groups that voters worry about women that are mothers of young children balancing caring for their children and doing the job. Voters even acknowledge that there is a double standard for women with young children and then still held women to that double standard. And we also found that in those same focus groups, voters didn't even want to think about women having a social life. They thought that if women were leaders, they should be either caring for their family or thinking about work. And I think that that is at the root of a lot of the criticism that we have heard over the past couple of weeks.
So much progress, yet so many barriers still remain. Well, Ali Vitale and Amanda Hunter, it's so good to talk with you both on this topic. I could talk about it for hours, but we only had a few minutes. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.